Hello, I'm Professor Toybox, and this is Sorcerer's Apprentice Mickey, and we would like to welcome you to Agrabah for a special crossover episode of Toybox Tutorials. In my Aladdin series, I've been building the city of Agrabah, and one of the activities that I want to add is a horse race. For that, we need the Path Creator tool, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to do a lesson on checkpoint paths and show you how you can use the Path Creator to set up a race or a route that you want the player to take. To create a horse race, we're also going to need two other toys that we haven't talked about yet, the Challenge Maker and the Timer. So for today's crossover episode, you're actually going to get 3 tutorials in one. So we got a lot to cover, so let's get started. And we'll begin by dropping a horse out here. We'll need that for our race. And the first thing we'll do is we'll drop the path and set up the path for our race. And I'm going to do this race around the city of Agrabah. So we'll drop the starting point right out here. And that puts us into point creation mode. And I'm going to run another point up here on the corner of this building, which should give us a good curve around that corner. And then we'll put another one down here on the corner of this building, like that. And then I'm going to line up another one about halfway with that little peninsula. And we're going to put it out this way. Let's see. This should be pretty good. About like that. And run another one out over here. And about the center of that archway, like this. And we'll put another one down here, and I'm trying to get around that sand dune there. And that should do. The next point we'll put down here off the corner of this building, that stairway. And then down here, about right like that, actually should be pretty close. Oops, thought I hit the button. Guess not. And the next one we'll put down here about midway on that building and about the middle of the road. And that'll be our last point. And that gives us a path all the way around the city. Then we'll come over here to the properties for the Path Creator and close that into a loop. We'll set the looped flag on. Auto start will be off, and we'll come back and set the other properties in a moment. Let's just make sure the path around the city looks pretty good. So that looks nice. That looks good. We're cutting the edge of that hill there, but I think that's all right. Yeah, these will work good. All the turns look pretty good. Okay, so far, this is pretty much what we've done in the past. But now we're going to tweak this path a little bit in the properties in order to make this a checkpoint path. So if we come down here, there's a couple of properties. There's this default path checkpoint display. And you have several options here for how to display the checkpoints. And the checkpoints are going to be the path points. These are the points that we want the player to pass through during the race. And you can have them appear like a racing gate or a challenge ring or a challenge orb, or any number of other collectibles. So you can set up a path of collectibles or whatever, and just leave the default of racing gate. And then there's this race lap count, and sometimes you won't see this when you first display the properties, and if that's the case, just come in here and select racing gate, and just press the select button, and then the race lap count property will appear. And I'm going to set this to just 1 lap. And now the path is set up and ready to go. But we're going to need 2 other toys in order to make this usable, playable race. The first one is going to be the challenge maker. And I'm going to drop this right over here. And this lets you create a Toybox game, basically, with a starting condition and an ending condition. And if we open this up and come into the properties, we'll look at this first. So we can do auto start on Toybox game load, and what this does is when this option is turned on, this challenge maker will automatically start when the Toybox game is loaded. Now, in order to do that, you actually have to save it as a Toybox game. You have to save this Toybox as a Toybox game, and you do that with the Toybox game maker Creativitoy, which we haven't covered yet, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. The results score label is what you want to see on the final results screen at the end of the challenge. And you have a number of options under here. You can do points, time, enemies defeated, how many times you're defeated, how many gates you've passed through, or whatever. And I'm going to do time for this one. Results rank order. This basically lets you change whether the player with the highest score wins or the player with the lowest score wins. So however your game is counting versus other games, you may want to set this one way or the other. High to low is fine for me. Start location. You have several options here. You can do separate locations for each player. You can start all the players at one location, or you can have separate locations for teams if you're using teams. We haven't talked about teams yet, so I'm not going to cover that. But we'll use the default of separate player 1 and player 2 locations. And then the end location lets you decide where your characters end up after the challenge is done. And you can leave them wherever they happen to be at the time. You can put them back on the challenge maker. You can use a locator to specify where you want them to be, and you can also have them show up at separate locations. And I'm going to leave this set at the current location. And then you can use that end location on abort or not, so we can set it to on. Since we're using the player's current location, we don't really need to set this. On or off won't make any difference. This option, turning it on, really only applies to the other choices that are in this list. Quit the Toybox game when ended. This goes along with the property up here for auto starting. And so if you've saved your Toybox as a Toybox game and you start this challenge when the Toybox is loaded, then when the challenge is done, it'll quit the Toybox. Most of the time I leave this off. Game start countdown. This will display a 3, 2, 1, go message at the beginning of the challenge, and that's on by default. If for some reason you don't want that, you can turn it off. Title and description lets you add a name for your challenge and a description of what they can expect from it. These 2 fields now no longer work because the Disney Infinity servers are offline, so there's no way to fill these out. So you can skip those. And the final property is the challenge type. And you can specify whether you want your players to be able to use vehicles or mounts, whether you want them to start on foot, whether you don't want them to use any vehicles or mounts, whether you want to lock them into a ground vehicle so they have to stay in the ground vehicle during the whole challenge, or the same with a mount or a sprinting mount, or helicopter, fixed-wing vehicles. So you have some limits you can impose. I'm going to leave mine set to all vehicles and mounts, and that way I can choose the horse I want to ride if I want to put several of them out here. Otherwise, we could force them to be on a mount at the start of the challenge, and if we did that, we can pick which type of mount we want to give them. And I'm actually going to take this out and go back to all vehicles and mounts. And then there's a number of logic connections with the challenge maker. Invites accepted. This signal is sent when all players have accepted the invites to the challenge. And then started. This trigger signal is sent right after the 3, 2, 1, go message is done. Game ended is always sent regardless of whether the challenge was won, lost, or aborted, and it occurs immediately after the challenge ends. This one is only sent when the challenge is successfully completed. This one is sent when the challenge is failed. And results closed is sent after the player closes the scoreboard results screen at the end. And so that's the challenge maker. And so to hook this up to the path for our race, I'm going to come down to the new logic connection. And we're going to set this up so that on invites accepted, so when all players have agreed to the race, we're going to come over to the Path Creator tool, and we want to start checkpoint path tracking. And this will start the path in checkpoint mode, where it will track the player as they progress around the path. And on the challenge maker, a new logic connection, when the game is ended, whether it was successfully completed or failed or aborted, however the game ends, we're going to come over to the challenge maker, or over to the path creator rather, and we want to stop checkpoint path tracking, and that'll turn that off, because once the race is over, there's no need for the path to keep track of the gates you're passing through. And then on the path, what we want to do is do a new logic connection from here. And you have several trigger signals related to checkpoint paths. You can use this to trigger other toys when checkpoint path tracking is started or stopped. You can set up connections to other toys when a lap is complete or when the race is complete. So those 4 signals go along with checkpoint path, and it's pretty easy because they all start with that. And I want to know when the race is done. So under checkpoint path race complete, and we can specify who completes it. So I want to know when player 1 is complete and they've crossed the finish line. We'll come over to the challenge maker, and now these are the behaviors or inputs that you can specify to the challenge maker. So you can have it start a game, you can have it complete the game, you can tell it that the game failed, and you can log the player completion. And I'm going to go ahead and log that player 1 completed. So when player 1 crosses the finish line, that will log their completion. And we'll do the same thing for player 2, so a new logic connection. When the race is complete for player 2, we'll come over to the challenge maker and we'll log player 2's completion. And so the first one crosses the finish line, doesn't end the challenge. We wait until both players cross so that we know what their final time is going to be. And that's really all there is to the checkpoint paths. It's just a matter of turning it on and off when you want to do it, and then doing something in response to the player passing through each of the points or the final point when the race is complete. And in our case, we're logging their completion with the challenge maker. Okay, there's one more toy that we need. And actually, before we get to that, one more thing with the challenge maker, because right now, when we step on the challenge maker and we start the challenge, we're still going to be on the challenge maker, and we kind of like them over here at the starting line. And so I'm going to drop down 2 locators, and I want to put it so that the dot is facing, that little turquoise dot is facing the starting line. Having the path in there has caused the performance meter to peg a little bit, depending on where I'm pointing in the toy box, where I'm pointing the camera. So now we have 2 locators, and I'm going to come over to the challenge maker, and rather than starting on the challenge maker, we had the properties set up to start at separate player 1 and player 4 locations, and we can specify that with a new locator connection. And so we can come over here, for example, and we can make this the starting location for player 1 or the blue team. So we're going to make player 1 start there. And a new locator connection. And we'll make player 2 start there. Okay, so now we're ready for the last toy that we need, and that's the timer. And again, we haven't talked about the timer yet either, so this is the third toy we're going to talk about today. Might have been faster to go the other way. There it is. All right, so we'll put the timer over here. Normally a race like this would be the very last thing I would add to this toy box because the path tends to bog it down, as you're seeing. All right, so the timer basically lets you keep track of time. And if we come under the properties, there's 3 properties. There's a target time, and so by default the timer will count down from the target time. And so by default it's 300. This is 300 seconds, and so this would be 5 minutes. And if you want your timer to count up, like in our case, we would basically turn that off. So it's no longer counting down, it's going to count up. And now the target time doesn't really matter because it's going to start at 0. And visible display is whether or not you want to actually see the time on the screen. We'll leave that on. And we'll get back to the logic connections for that in a moment. So to interact with the timer, the first thing we're going to do is come over to the challenge maker, and we'll do a new logic connection on invites accepted. So when all the players have agreed to do the race, we'll come over to the timer. And now there's a number of behaviors you can direct this toy to do. You can tell it to start the timer or pause the timer. You can also have it reset, which in our case would put it back to 0. If you were counting down, it would put it back to the target time. You can hide it, remove it from the display, or show it on the display. And you can also add or subtract time. So if you wanted to have a penalty case, for example, you could have it deduct time from the clock. And in our case, what I want to do is show the timer display. So as soon as all the players have agreed to the race, we'll turn the timer on and display it on the screen. The next thing we want to do is a new logic connection on started. So as soon as we have the 3, 2, 1 countdown and it says go, we want to come over to the timer and start the timer. So this will begin counting time. And then likewise, a new logic connection when the game is ended. We want to come over and pause the timer. And lock the time in. And then a new logic connection when the results are closed at the very end and the race is all done and the player's seen the results. We can come over to the timer and reset it. Now, on the timer, what you could do for some races, and we don't really need this for this race, but just for thoroughness, you can do a new logic connection on the timer, and there's 4 trigger signals that this can broadcast that you can hook up other toys to. And so you can use this so that when the timer is started, you can trigger other toys with this toy. When the timer expires, which means in our case, it doesn't really matter. I guess when it reached the target time, which would be 5 minutes, this trigger signal would go off and we can trigger things. So if you wanted to have a time challenge, see how many kills you can get in 5 minutes, then when the 5 minutes is over, this would go off. Or if you were counting down from the target time, this timer would go off when you reach 0. You can also connect to other toys when the timer is paused and when it's reset. And again, I don't need any of these for this particular challenge, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel. Now the last thing we need is to see the time results at the end. And so we'll come to the challenge maker, and we're going to do a new time results connection. And we're going to connect to the timer and link that for results. And if we were using a scoreboard, which we haven't talked about yet, or a counter, you can basically connect those instead. And now that we've connected the timer, you notice that option is gone. So there we go. We're all set for our horse race. We have a horse, we have the challenge maker set up, and a timer, and our path to go, and starting locations for 2 players. So now let's come out here. Now we could run this race with Mickey, but since this is a crossover episode, I'm going to bring in Aladdin as a special guest and let him run the race instead. After all, it is his toy box.
Couldn't stay away, huh?
No, we couldn't. And we'll go ahead and hop on the horse. And we'll come over to the challenge maker. And now it comes up automatically and says Start Challenge. Go! And now that gate turned on. And now the next one turns on. And it would do this for each of the players. So if the second player hadn't got to the gate yet, it would still light up like this until they got through. But you can see it's displayed a racing gate for each of the points on the path. And the timer is going up top. And if you wanted to make this a little bit more exciting, you could add some obstacles and hurdles and traps and different things to mix things up a little bit. But this is your basic horse race, so we're coming up to the finish line. And there we go.
Yeah!
And now it shows the time results. And then as soon as we exit, we're all done. So I think that was good to have Aladdin run the course, since this is his toy box. But this is Toybox Tutorials, so we'll bring Mickey back in as we close this out.
Are you up for another adventure?
Yes, we are. Except we've just finished this one. So now you know how to create a checkpoint path, and you've seen one example of what you can do with it. Of course, it isn't limited to races. You can use the path creator to set up any route through your toy box that you want your players to take, and you can use the checkpoint capability to guide them through that path. Next time, I'll show you how to connect the player to a path, and we'll look at an example of why you might want to do that. Until then, I want to thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this special crossover episode with my Aladdin series. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel or sign up on my blog if you haven't already done that, so you don't miss the next lesson. That's all for me today. See you next time.